Welcome to the Deep Dive. This is where we dig into the sources you send us, looking for those key insights.
Yep, pulling out the core ideas.
And today, we're tackling a really big question.
Yeah.
Why are some nations rich and others poor?
It's fundamental, really.
We're basing this on excerpts you shared from Why Nations Fail by Daron Acemoglu and James Robinson. Great book, lots of buzz, even Nobel winners endorsing it.
Right, and their central argument, well, it's all about institutions, the political and economic rules a country lives by.
They kick things off with this striking example, Nogales. You've got Nogales, Arizona, and Nogales, Sonora, Mexico. Same location, same people, same culture, pretty much.
But worlds apart economically, one side thriving, the other struggling.
And that difference, right there on the border, that's what Acemoglu and Robinson say illustrates their whole point. It's the institutions.
Exactly. That's the puzzle they're trying to solve. It's not primarily about geography, tropical versus temperate, or about culture, or even about leaders being ignorant.
So forget lazy stereotypes about hot climates or certain cultures just not being cut out for success.
That's what they argue, yeah. They say the real driver is the nature of a nation's institutions. Those rules of the game, formal and informal, that shape everything. How society works, what people are incentivized to do or not do.
Okay, institutions it is. So what's the main distinction here? The book focuses on two types, right?
Correct. They draw this really critical line between inclusive and extractive economic institutions.
Inclusive first, what does that mean?
Inclusive economic institutions are the ones that, well, include broad sections of society. Think secure private property rights, knowing what's yours is yours. An unbiased legal system. Public services that help people participate, like education and infrastructure, freedom to start a business, choose your career.
Okay, so places where people have opportunity and protection.
Precisely. They point to places like the US or South Korea as examples where these kinds of institutions allowed innovation to flourish. Thomas Edison, Samsung, Hyundai. These didn't happen in a vacuum.
Right. People need to feel safe investing time and money, knowing they won't just have it taken away.
Exactly. It creates confidence. It allows talent and good ideas, wherever they come from, to actually succeed and ideally benefit society more broadly.
Okay, so that's the inclusive side. What about the extractive ones? Sounds less good.
Yeah, you could say that. Extractive economic institutions are essentially designed to, extract wealth and resources from one part of society to benefit a small elite.
So, rigging the game.
Pretty much. Think North Korea today, where the state controls almost everything. Or historically, colonial Latin America. The Spanish set up systems like the mita or encomienda.
Forced labor, basically.
Yes, forced labor, funneling resources back to the colonizers and a small local elite. Property rights were insecure for the vast majority, coercion was common, economic choices were severely limited, the powerful structure things to keep themselves powerful.
And I imagine these economic setups don't exist on their own. The book connects them strongly to politics, doesn't it?
Absolutely crucial connection. They argue that inclusive economic institutions need inclusive political institutions to survive and thrive.
Right.
Meaning political systems where power is distributed more broadly, not concentrated in the hands of a few, where there are checks and balances, ways to hold leaders accountable.
So democracy or something like it?
Often, yes, or at least systems with significant pluralism. When power is spread out, it's harder for one group to just rewrite the economic rules entirely for their own benefit.
And the flip side, extractive economic institutions usually have.
Extractive political institutions behind them. Power is concentrated, maybe in a dictator or a narrow oligarchy, and they use that power to maintain those extractive economic rules that benefit them. It's a reinforcing loop.
Which leads to this idea they talk about, these vicious and virtuous circles.
Exactly. Extractive institutions create a vicious circle. The elite benefiting from the system uses their political power to keep that system in place, blocking reforms that might threaten their position. This reinforces the extractive nature, making it harder and harder to break out.
And the virtuous circle.
With inclusive institutions, broader distribution of power and wealth makes it harder for any single group to capture the state and rig the rules. Success breeds more success, reinforcing participation and opportunity. It's a positive feedback loop.
Okay, so that's the core theory. Institutions, inclusive versus extractive, political and economic, feeding into each other. But Why Nations Fail also spends time pushing back against other common explanations, right? like geography.
Oh, yeah, they tackle that head on. You know, the old idea from thinkers like Montesquieu that tropical climates just make people inherently lazy or less capable of progress.
Right, the it's too hot to work argument.
Basically. But Asamoah and Robinson say, look at the history. They point to the reversal of fortune in the Americas. Before 1492, the richest, most complex civilizations were in places like Mexico and Peru, tropical or semi-tropical areas.
The Aztecs, the Incas.
Exactly. North America was relatively less developed. After colonization, it completely flipped. North America became much richer than those formerly advanced regions. The geography didn't change, but the institutions imposed by the colonizers did.
That's a powerful counterexample.
It is. They also mention the Middle East. It was a cradle of civilization. The Neolithic Revolution started there, but today faces many economic struggles. They argue this isn't geography, but rather the long-term legacy of institutions, like those under the Ottoman Empire. So initial geographic luck doesn't guarantee anything if the institutions go wrong.
Okay, so geography isn't destiny. What about culture? That's another popular one. Some cultures are just more pro-business or harder working.
They challenge that too. They mention stereotypes, like the manana culture, sometimes attributed to Latin America, or historical views about African work ethic, or even how Confucianism was once blamed for holding China back.
Which seems ironic now, given East Asia's economic rise.
Totally ironic. Views on culture can flip 180 degrees. Their point is, culture is often a consequence of institutions, not the primary cause of economic outcomes. They use the example of the Kingdom of Congo in the 1500s.
Okay.
The Congolese very quickly adopted firearms from the Portuguese, showed they weren't inherently resistant to new tech, but they didn't widely adopt the wheel or the plow. Why?
Why?
Because the dominant economic activity fueled by the Portuguese demand became the slave trade. Capturing people was more profitable within that institutional framework than investing in agricultural technology. The incentives shaped the technological adoption, not some deep cultural block.
So rules of the game again.
Always comes back to the rules and incentives. They also discuss Kwame Nkrumah's Ghana post-independence. Some big, expensive projects were built that didn't make much economic sense.
Bad planning.
Ignorance.
They argue it wasn't ignorance. It was about political survival, using state resources to reward supporters and consolidate power. Political logic, driven by the existing institutions, trumped economic rationality. So if it's not geography, not culture, not ignorance, it really does keep coming back to changing the political system to allow for better economic systems.
That's the core message. Sustained economic transformation requires political transformation towards inclusive political institutions. People need a voice. Power needs to be constrained.
They mention the Tahrir Square protests in Egypt as a modern echo of this desire for fundamental change.
Yeah, a mass movement demanding not just economic fixes, but a different political structure altogether. They draw parallels to historical turning points. England's Glorious Revolution in 1688, the French Revolution in 1789, the American Revolution. These were moments of profound political change that paved the way for different economic paths.
History is full of these examples, and the book dives into quite a few. Let's touch on some key ones. Colonialism seems huge.
Absolutely massive impact. Contrast the Spanish approach in Mexico and Peru, setting up extractive systems from the get-go, focusing on mining silver and gold using forced labor like the Mita. The goal was extraction for the crown and the elite.
Created a very unequal society from the start.
Deeply unequal, with institutions designed to maintain that inequality. Now compare that with early English North America. Jamestown, for instance, initially struggled. They tried coercion. It didn't work well. There weren't obvious riches like gold to just grab.
So they had to adapt.
They had to. A key shift happened in Virginia around 1618 with the headright system giving land to settlers, and crucially, the establishment of the General Assembly.
The beginnings of self-government.
Exactly. Early steps towards broader participation and property rights for settlers, not just an elite. A very different institutional trajectory was set compared to, say, the highly hierarchical, almost feudal plan laid out in the fundamental constitutions of Carolina, which ultimately failed.
That contrast is stark. What about innovation? Patents came up earlier.
Right. The English Statute of Monopolies in 1623 was an early step, trying to grant temporary monopolies to inventors rather than just royal favorites. But the U.S. patent system really took it further. It made patents accessible to ordinary people, not just the connected elite. Someone like Thomas Edison, from a modest background, could protect and profit from his inventions. This spurred widespread innovation.
Whereas in other places,
Like Mexico, they point out, access to finance was often controlled by politically connected banking monopolies. harder for an outsider with a good idea to get ahead. They even mention Carlos Slim, hugely successful in Mexico's environment, facing more constraints operating in the U.S. due to stronger antitrust enforcement and rule of law. Institutions matter for who gets to innovate and compete.
Fascinating. The book also talks about big shocks, like the Black Death, acting as critical junctures. How did that reshape institutions?
The Black Death wiped out a huge chunk of Europe's population in the 14th century. Suddenly, labor was scarce.
So, workers had more power.
In Western Europe, yes. Peasants could demand higher wages and better conditions. Feudal obligations weakened. Landlords tried to fight back, like with the Statute of Laborers in England trying to freeze wages. But the economic reality gave peasants leverage.
But not everywhere.
Not everywhere. In Eastern Europe, the lords often had more political power relative to the peasants and the towns, so they responded differently. They actually tightened their grip, imposing harsher forms of serfdom to keep control of the remaining labor force.
Same plague. Different outcomes because of the starting institutions.
Exactly, a critical juncture, but the path taken depended on the existing balance of power and institutional setup.
Then there's the Glorious Revolution in England, 1688. That seems like a landmark moment in the book's narrative.
Hugely important. It fundamentally shifted power from the monarch to parliament. This wasn't just political musical chairs. It led to more secure property rights, predictable government finance, and a state that was more responsive in some ways to the interests of merchants and manufacturers.
Creating the conditions
For the Industrial Revolution, arguably, James Watt and others could innovate, invest, and build businesses with greater confidence that the rules wouldn't suddenly change or their property be seized arbitrarily. Compare that to Venice, which was innovative early on, but then its political institutions became more closed, more extractive, strangling innovation over time.
So the Glorious Revolution wasn't just about kings and queens. It was about laying the institutional groundwork for economic takeoff.
That's the argument. The Industrial Revolution happened in England first, not just because of clever inventors, but because the institutional climate was right. Parliament actively supported economic development, reorganizing land use, protecting industries like textiles with acts like the Manchester Act of 1736.
And other places resisted this kind of change.
Absolutely. The Ottoman Empire famously resisted the printing press for centuries, partly because religious authorities and scribes feared losing their influence. In France, Louis XIV government suppressed innovations like Lee's knitting machine, fearing unemployment and social unrest. Guilds, like the boatmen who opposed Papin's steamboat, fought to protect their monopolies. Resistance to change that threatens established interests is a hallmark of extractive systems.
And even when industrialization started, it caused conflict, right? The Peterloo Massacre.
Right. In Manchester, 1819, industrialization created new wealth, but also new social problems and demands for political representation from the growing working class and industrialists in cities that had little voice in the old system. It highlights the ongoing struggle between entrenched interests and the push for more inclusive political institutions that often accompanies economic change.
The book uses so many contrasts, England moving towards inclusion versus Spain strengthening absolutism after 1688, which made it harder for the state to even function effectively, like collecting taxes.
Yes. Or Tsarist Russia, under Nicholas I, actively fearing industrialization because it might empower groups outside the landed aristocracy. Finance Minister Cancrin deliberately held back railway development.
Wow.
Or China under the Ming Dynasty with its state monopoly limiting overseas trade and private enterprise. Ethiopia's history of intense absolutism controlling economic life. It's a recurring pattern.
But they also note it's not just about having strong central control, right? Somalia is an example of the opposite problem.
Exactly. You need some degree of state centralization to provide basic order, enforce laws, and provide public goods. Somalia had a sort of pluralism, different clans, but lacked a state effective enough to prevent chaos. So even if power wasn't totally concentrated, the lack of order meant no foundation for prosperity. You need both political centralization and inclusive institutions.
Okay, moving through history. Colonialism's legacy continued to play out.
Definitely. Look at the Dutch East India Company in the Spice Islands. Incredibly brutal, extractive policies in places like Benda focused solely on maximizing spice profits, destroying local societies and economies with long-lasting negative effects.
And even within Africa, after the transatlantic slave trade was abolished.
The nature of slavery shifted. Instead of exporting slaves, powerful states like Asante or Dahomey used slave labor internally for producing goods like palm oil for export. But the institutions remained fundamentally extractive. built on coercion, just reoriented.
Independence didn't always fix things either.
Sadly, no. In many places, independence simply saw a new elite take over the old colonial extractive machinery. Sierra Leone is an example where post-independence leaders kept control of things like agricultural marketing boards and the diamond trade, continuing to extract wealth much like the British had.
Guatemala, too.
Guatemala is another case study of persistent extractive institutions tracing back to the Spanish encomienda and evolving through various forms of forced labor, benefiting a small landed elite right up to modern times.
Even within a generally more inclusive country like the U.S., the book points to the South as having its own extractive system.
Absolutely. Slavery was a brutal extractive economic institution. It enriched the planter elite, but stifled broader prosperity and innovation in the South. And after the Civil War, despite the abolition of slavery,
Black codes came in.
exactly, laws designed explicitly to control black labor and keep it cheap, essentially trying to recreate the plantation economy without formal slavery. And the failure of Reconstruction allowed the old planter elite to regain political power and disenfranchise black citizens for decades, locking the South into relative poverty for a long time.
It really drives home that idea of the vicious circle being hard to break.
It really does. They give many examples post-independence Africa where leaders often replicated colonial practices. Zimbabwe under Mugabe, Colombia's long struggles with instability where elites sometimes cut deals with paramilitaries rather than building a strong, impartial state.
Uzbekistan's cotton industry sounds particularly grim.
Extremely. Based on systematic forced labor, including children, organized by the state under President Karimov, echoes of Stalinist extraction, or Egypt under Mubarak, where a kind of crony capitalism developed, benefiting those connected to the regime. These cycles are powerful.
But it's not hopeless. The book does offer examples of breaking the mold.
It does. Botswana is often cited as a relative success story in Africa. They argue that pre-colonial tribal institutions provided some basis for pluralism, and post-independence leadership made choices that fostered more inclusive development, particularly managing diamond wealth relatively well.
And the U.S. South eventually did start to change.
Yes, gradually. It involved a long struggle by black Southerners, crucial federal intervention through the civil rights movement, and economic changes that made the old cheap labor system less viable for Southern elites. It was a slow, contested process, a breaking of the vicious circle.
China's recent history fits here too, presumably.
In a complex way, post-Mao reforms dramatically shifted away from highly extractive economic institutions, introducing market incentives and unleashing growth. But, as the authors stress, the political institutions remain extractive, controlled by the Communist Party. Whether that model is sustainable long-term without political inclusion is a key question the book raises.
So looking back at all this, the path nations take isn't predetermined. History is contingent.
That's a really important takeaway. Critical junctures like the Black Death, discovery of the Americas, revolutions, independence, they create openings. But what happens next depends on the choices made, the balance of power, the institutions already in place. History matters enormously, but it's not destiny.
Okay, so wrapping this deep dive up, the core message from Why Nations Fail, based on the excerpts you sent, is pretty clear. Lasting prosperity comes from inclusive institutions.
Right. Political and economic institutions that create broad incentives, secure property, uphold the rule of law, and allow people to participate and benefit. It's not about resources or culture nearly as much as it is about these rules of the game.
And we've seen through all these examples, getting from extractive to inclusive is tough.
It's incredibly challenging, complex, often violent, and certainly not guaranteed. Those vicious cycles are hard to escape.
It definitely gives you a powerful lens for looking at the world, thinking about how much these institutional frameworks matter. It leaves you wondering, doesn't it? What seemingly small changes in rules, in governance, in how power is checked or shared today, might actually set a society on a profoundly different course decades down the line.
That's the multi-billion-dollar question, isn't it? Something to ponder.
Definitely food for thought. Thanks for diving into this with us.